Hey guys, Tom Barton from TomBartonSports.com here. We're going to talk about the Hall of Fame today and who should be inducted and who should always remain outside of the Hall of Fame. Look, it's a controversial topic, but I want to get into it. It's fresh in my mind. We'll have a conversation here. Look, guys, if you like the channel, please make sure you subscribe, tell your friends, go check out TomBartonSports.com and Tom Barton Sports over on Twitter. I also have a podcast. Just type in Tom Barton and you can go check out all of my podcasts. So, guys, look, I went and I took my son and daughter. My whole family went up to the Hall of Fame last week, and it really did get me thinking, what is the Hall of Fame? Because we do have the vote coming up in a couple of weeks, and it's always a topic of conversation, right? I mean, it's always something that everybody loves to not only have a conversation about, but debate about. So I want to bring up a few specific points. First of all, I want to set the scene before I go into the controversy. And the big controversy that I want to talk about this week is, David Ortiz. The man should just not be allowed in the Hall of Fame. I'll get into that in a minute. Before we begin, I want to say, look, the Hall of Fame itself was absolutely fantastic. It was a great time. The Great Hall, as they call it, for those that haven't been there, what you do is you go through the Hall of Fame and you begin with the history of baseball, and they have old artifacts of old baseballs themselves, and you have artifacts of when the game was around in the 1700s. You see some writings in books from all the way back talking about baseball, right? Then you go through how the game sort of evolved. It evolved from a street game and then eventually to a game that was being paid, some of the big influencers. And then you walk into this room where it's individual players that are being really, just, I don't want to say the word worship because that's the wrong word, but it is put on a pedestal, and as they should be. Babe Ruths of the world, of course, Ty Cobb. You have a Negro League section, which is fantastic. Then you come around the corner, you have the Women's American Baseball League, Hank Aaron. The league gives a good representation of the Hispanic influence. Then you go and you see old baseball cards and artifacts. Go up to the second floor. It's all about the stadiums and the fans. They have lockers. They have Stan Musial's locker, Mickey Mantle's locker, Joe DiMaggio's locker, Lou Gehrig's locker, Babe Ruth's locker, of course. And you go through, the history of Major League Baseball. In this process, then you go up to the next floor, and in the next floor, what do you have? Well, you have about the history of fans. You have fans, and then you have stadiums, and you have tickets, and you have mascots. And this is the fun area for the kids, for sure. It's very interactive. The last area you walk down, and it's all of fake lockers of every single baseball team, and inside the locker, accomplishments with most home runs, biggest home run ball, longest strikeout streak, most steals in a season, the record room. And, this is what the Hall of Fame is. It's not just the plaques. But you finally end the tour, if you do it the right way, you finally end the tour in the Great Hall. And the Great Hall have the plaques with the faces on them and a little inscription about what they are. And the plaques, you can see they've been around since the first class. They've been around, going all the way back to commemorate the greatest players of all time. Now, it's not only the players. There are umpires there. There are some broadcasters. There are marvels of the game, we'll call them. And that is where they want to have a conversation about. That is what we all try to talk about. We say things like, oh, they shouldn't be in the Hall of Fame. Pete Rose shouldn't be in the Hall of Fame. Let me tell you something. Pete Rose is in the Hall of Fame. Pete Rose is in the Hall of Fame because he's the hit king, and he's got the most hits. Pete Rose is in the Hall of Fame because they have artifacts of Pete Rose. They have giant boards in the Hall of Fame that show him beating the hit record. So you could actually watch video clips of players. So Pete Rose is in the Hall of Fame, but he's not enshrined with a plaque. And now it gets to the controversial conversation. Controversial conversation is the Hall of Fame overblown? Well, before we get into who should not be there, and I will get into David Ortiz, let me just say that, look, from my perspective, the Hall of Fame has gotten into a position where it's too wide open. There are players that don't deserve to be next to the greats of the greats. That's my opinion. I think the Hall of Fame should be reduced down. But when you start to talk about the reduction down of the Hall of Fame, you start to have a conversation about who should be. And that is kind of why I believe that there shouldn't be a conversation about this. It is good for business, we'll say. It's good for topic of conversation. It's good for Major League Baseball to have differing opinions. It's good for Major League Baseball to be in that spotlight. It's good for Major League Baseball, and I understand that. But at the end of the day, we should be more selective about the Hall of Fame. But if you are going to open up the doors, then you have to open up the doors to everybody. Prime example, of course, you see, I have the Babe Ruth stuff on, and I'm a giant Babe Ruth historian. But another New York Yankee would be Don Mattingly. People push for him to be in the Hall of Fame. Now, in my Hall of Fame, Don Mattingly wouldn't be there. Potentially my favorite player that I watched growing up, maybe of all time. But he shouldn't be in the Hall of Fame, in my Hall of Fame. But the moment you start putting a guy like Kirby Puckett in the Hall of Fame, don't you have to put Don Mattingly in the Hall of Fame? I mean, don't you almost have to? And this is kind of the conversation and the snowball effect that we're going to talk about in a moment on a bigger scale when we talk about the steroid players. Kirby Puckett as a guy, you could say, he's deserving. Well, he's got 318 batting average. Hits, he's got 1,071 hits, home runs, 207 RBIs, 1,085 in 1,783 games. Well, Don Mattingly has nearly identical games. Don Mattingly played 2 more games than him in his entire career. He's got more home runs at 222. He's got more RBIs at 1099. He's got 307 batting average compared to a 318, but it's still over 300. So that should matter. And then there's the idea that in my Hall of Fame, at least for what I always say, in my Hall of Fame, you have to consider some intangibles. Well, Kirby Puckett's got a World Series ring. Absolutely an intangible. That's that secondary thing. Well, Babe Ruth was the best player in baseball, the best hitter in baseball for a number of years, something that Kirby Puckett never was. I'm sorry, I said Babe Ruth. Don Mattingly was also one of the greatest fielders of all time. Of all time. Don Mattingly is 4th in all-time fielding percentage. You could say, he's in the top 10 all-time with a 996 career fielding percentage when you take out his time at third base and outfield. So all of a sudden, Don Mattingly is the way superior defensive player. We're talking about putting a guy like Omar Vizquel in. Well, Don Mattingly is a way superior defensive player than Kirby Puckett was, albeit in an easier position, but he's not in. So this wasn't supposed to be about Don Mattingly, this conversation. This conversation was not supposed to be a Mattingly-centric conversation. Just to give you an idea of my mindset is once you open the doors to somebody, well, somebody very similar needs to get in. Now, in my Hall of Fame, Kirby Puckett wouldn't be there. My Hall of Fame, Don Mattingly wouldn't be there. But once you put Kirby Puckett in, don't you then have to put in other players? Don't you then have to include Don Mattingly? And this leads us to the topic that I want to talk about, and that is David Ortiz. David Ortiz should be nowhere near the Hall of Fame. David Ortiz should not go in. Now, let me calm down all the Boston fans right now and just say, listen to my argument before you freak out. First of all, David Ortiz is already in the Hall of Fame. I told you that there are players that are in the Hall of Fame. They're just there, right? They are just in the Hall of Fame because of accomplishments. David Ortiz has a section for what he did for the city of Boston. He has a section because he has hit monumental home runs. That is fine. You're in the Hall of Fame in that capacity. But David Ortiz should never be enshrined in the Hall of Fame if you believe steroid players should not be enshrined. Now, there is surprising, in my opinion, there is a giant, I don't want to say monument to, but an explanation, giant window in the Hall of Fame about steroid players. And steroid players there, you have Ryan Braun, you have McGuire, you have Sosa, you have the steroid era fairly represented inside the Hall of Fame. Don't make any doubt about it. They are shying away from it rather than enshrine them. But they're in the Hall of Fame. And you could read about it, and you could ask questions. And as a matter of fact, it is a pretty large area dedicated to them. My problem is, and by the way, A-Rod's there. Right? My problem is directly across the hall. You stand here, you turn around like this. There's a David Ortiz jersey. No, he's not in that case. And he's not in the case with the cheats of the game. And that's who they are, the cheats of the game. He's not in there because Major League Baseball has somehow or another christened David Ortiz to be this bastion of goodness when he is a cheat, just like them. Now, if you believe, guys, that everyone should get into the Hall of Fame, it doesn't matter if they took steroids or not, well, look, you probably don't want to listen to this right now, but I'm going to get to you guys in a moment. My argument is against the people that, well, look, put everybody in. We'll get to you in a second. But if you're saying, you know what, David Ortiz is not a cheat, well, yes, he is. If you are saying steroid people, Bonds, Clemens, Sosa, McGuire, I don't know if they were getting in anyway, but those guys, if you're telling me you don't want them in your Hall of Fame, you don't think they deserve to be in your Hall of Fame, and how is David Ortiz not? David Ortiz has a failed test. We know that. There's no other way around that. David Ortiz also was just a different player, and we know that as well. We know David Ortiz was a Minnesota Twin until he was 27 years old. He was a Minnesota Twin that never hit more than 20 home runs going into his age 27 season. He was a Minnesota Twin with many years underneath that. He came up when he was 21 years old. So as a Minnesota Twin, and you could see the baseball card where he's about as skinny as I am, right? Probably skinnier. Then he blew up. Well, he magically blew up. And he magically blew up in his age 27 season. His age 27 season when he went to Boston. His age 27 season where he went to Boston and, oh, by the way, finished fifth in the MVP race. His age 27 season when he did the first time in his career where he hit over 20 home runs. His age 27 season where later on in life we found out in 2003, that age 27 season, that's when he tested positive for steroids. There is no arguing this fact. That's it. 2003 is the year where they were all busted. The Balco investigation. 2003 is where the 100 names came out. 2003 is where David Ortiz was known to take steroids. His body changed. He became a 30 home run hitter. He became a very good player. He changed cities in Boston. This happened later on in his career. The numbers speak for themselves. David Ortiz after that year, 31, 41, 47, 54, 35. This is the home run numbers. 148 RBIs, 137 RBIs. This is a guy that, guys, never hit more than 75. He's doubling his total in 2 years. Oh, by the way, let's not forget, tested positive for steroids. So you go, okay, well, you know what? He only had the one time. He never took it after that, right? I mean, that's the mindset. Well, Barry Bonds never actually got caught doing steroids, right? I mean, are we saying okay? Roger Clemens never got caught doing steroids. Now, you could tell me that Brian McAbee, well, he kind of outed him. Well, you know, there was a certain Boston Globe reporter in his own hometown that later on in life accused David Ortiz of continuing to take steroids. So accusations are out there. Clemens and Bonds never failed anything more than the same test that David Ortiz failed. But there was accusations. People said, oh, look at Barry Bonds. Of course, look at his giant head. Look, I agree. I don't think anyone is saying that Barry Bonds didn't take steroids. But he never failed the test after the same report that David Ortiz was on. Roger Clemens, oh, there's no way. The guy's throwing bats at people, right? He's having roid rages out there. Yeah, but outside of Brian McAbee, kind of a disgraced peon, we'll call him, no evidence about Roger Clemens other than the same list that David Ortiz was on. David Ortiz also spent continuous years with a guy named Manny Ramirez who did fail multiple tests. And you can say, well, you know what? David Ortiz tested more than anybody else. David Ortiz, in his own Tribune editorial, in his own situation where he wanted to come out, said, I get tested more than anyone else in Major League Baseball. They test me all the time. They test me constantly. He gave ridiculous numbers. He gave ridiculous, just out of control situation numbers where, I'm tested all the time. I'm tested every day. Well, wait a minute. You either believe David Ortiz or you don't. If you don't believe David Ortiz, well, now he's just lying to cover something up, isn't he? Now he's just lying to kind of overcompensate for the fact that we all know you're a cheat. We all know that's who you are. Or David Ortiz, you take him for face value. You believe David Ortiz. Okay, well, Major League Baseball says the only way that you would be tested like that, the only way that you would be tested time and time and time again, and more than the regular random test, is if you were caught cheating. If you were already in the program, what they call it, that's when you would get tested multiple times. Did David Ortiz sort of out himself there? Well, again, that is the steroid argument. There is no argument here, guys. David Ortiz's entire career is backed on the fact that he took steroids in 2003, failed a test in 2003, changed his entire approach to his game, became the player that he is because of steroids, and he took them. If you are telling me that Bonds and Clemens, who had Hall of Fame level careers before they failed that test, David Ortiz had a Hall of Fame career only after he failed that test. If you're telling me Bonds and Clemens aren't enshrined and you're not going to vote for them because they are cheaters, then you cannot vote David Ortiz in. Now let's look at the other side. Oh, Tom, you know what? I don't really care. I don't care if he cheated or not because he's a steroid guy. You know what? Let all the steroid guys in. All right? Compelling argument. I don't agree with that argument, but I get it. There are guys out there, there are writers and there are voters that will say, absolutely, you have to vote the steroid guys in. They were a big part of baseball. I don't care about it. That's fine. So we go back to David Ortiz. If you're voting for that and saying everybody that took steroids, just let them in and that's fine. I'm going to vote for them in regardless if they took it or not. Do you want David Ortiz to be the first steroid user in? David Ortiz's career as a DH that began when he was 27 years old. Do you want that to go in over Barry Bonds? Do you want him to go in over Roger Clemens? You know, if, again, we go back, and this is why I had the conversation about Mattingly and Puckett. If you open the doors to Bonds and Clemens and said, look, they're no-brainers, they're obviously had Hall of Fame careers before the steroids. And then you started to have conversations about A-Rod. Okay, you know what? He failed it during the, all right, he gets a little sketchy. But Bonds and Clemens opened the door. Then I can understand someone saying, look, we know David Ortiz took steroids. We understand that, but they let Bonds and Clemens in. You got to let this guy in. Okay, now the floodgates are open. But that hasn't happened. Bonds and Clemens have been on the ballot year after year after year and not being allowed to go to the Hall of Fame. Could you imagine if the first Hall of Fame player that is inducted into the Hall of Fame that has a steroid background is David Ortiz, a DH whose entire career began the same year where he failed the test, as opposed to Barry Bonds, who was a Hall of Fame player if he never put something into his arm. Roger Clemens, one of the greatest pitchers of all time, before he put something into his arm. No, you can't do that. So we go back to the conversation of David Ortiz, because this is a David Ortiz situation. Makes me sick to my stomach to think that David Ortiz's big smiling, big poppy, everybody loves him face is going to be enshrined in the Hall of Fame in the Great Hall with the likes of just true, real, down-to-earth baseball legacy people like Lou Gehrig, like Bob Gibson, like Roberto Clemente. People that would have laid their life on the line for this game, that did everything for this sport. They gave up it all. They bled for this sport. This was everything. They had integrity. Yeah, David Ortiz, you didn't. The minute you put that into your arm and became the player that you are, you cheated. You cheated. Now, again, we go back and say, if you want to put all cheaters in, well, again, you can't make David Ortiz be the first. So I left the Hall of Fame on a giant high. I said, man, that was amazing. That was a wonderful experience. I love the fact that I could share it with my children. But when you're there with your children, and especially if you're there, with a baseball fan like my young son is, and you're getting asked questions, you start to realize that you're unraveling things, right? And you can form the answers in the way that you want to form them, but the facts don't kind of come away, right? No matter how much you peel, you can't peel away facts. At the core of everything is going to be the truth. And when we're going through the Great Hall, and I'm speaking about a Joe DiMaggio, I'm going to tell a couple of stories. I'm speaking about Mickey Mantle. I'm going to tell his stories, okay, for good or for bad. And I said, look, Mickey, off the field. Oh, well, Dad, what happened to him? Well, he didn't take care of his body, right? You have to say that. I mean, you just have to. There are people in the Hall of Fame that are flawed. I'm not saying that they're not. There are people in the Hall of Fame that I know we go back and we go, that guy might have been a racist. Yep. Absolutely. There are people in the Hall of Fame that may not have been great to their wives. Yep, absolutely. There are people in the Hall of Fame that are massively flawed. And cheating on the game, look, it's a horrific offense. But if you're going to put in one, don't let it be David Ortiz to be the first one. If you're going to go down that path of this man cheated on the game, that's why I'm not putting in Barry Bonds. This man cheated the game, the integrity of the game. That's why I'm not putting in Roger Clemens. This man, I didn't like because of, all his failed tests. That's why you don't put in A-Rod. I get that. But how can you crucify Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, and the rest of these guys and turn a blind eye to David Ortiz? If you allow Bonds and Clemens in, put David Ortiz in. Okay? We've opened up the floodgates. I won't be happy about the floodgates being open, but I'll accept it. But you can't sit back and tell me that Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens are going to sit back. They're going to watch David Ortiz walk to the stage, knowing he failed the same test as they did, knowing the same evidence is against them as is against Ortiz, but he's walking in with a lesser career, lesser talent for sure, than both of them. That's a travesty. I don't want to explain that to my son. I would rather explain the case of guys that cheated. Here you go. And I'd rather explain Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens if I have to. And my solution here, and I always say this, look, if you're going to fire a manager, tell me who's coming in. If you're going to fire a coach, tell me who's coming in next. If you're going to make changes in your life, you want to get rid of your car, cool, what's your next car? If you're going to make changes, have solutions. Well, here's my solution. Invite the entire steroid class that you believe, right, to be steroid guys, but no-brainer guys that should be in the Hall of Fame. I could include Ortiz there, Roger Clemens, A-Rod, Manny Ramirez, even guys that even cheated later on. Include them all together, give them their own section, and call it, the steroid section. Whatever, come up with a classy name. I don't think you could call it the steroid section. But you put them all in together. You don't give them a day up in Cooperstown. Oh, no. You don't get a day to be celebrated. But you're enshrined and you're in. Again, the floodgates. If you do that, you got to bring in Pete Rose. You got to bring in Shoeless Joe. But it's an idea that I think we'd all be okay with. Put them in. Don't give them a day. They earn their way in on the field, most of them, albeit cheating the system, albeit with, inflated stats, whatever it might be. But you can't tell me in one respect that this great hall is so sacred. And I'm not talking about the Hall of Fame. I'm talking about the plaques. It's so sacred that Joe Jackson, Shoeless Joe, can't get in. It's so sacred that Pete Rose can't get in. It's so sacred that Barry Bonds cannot get in. It's so sacred Roger Clemens can get in. And then sully that integrity by putting David Ortiz in. Can't do it. All right, guys, that's going to do it for me. Please comment below. I think that this is a controversial topic that I do want to hear from you guys. Go check out TomBartonSports.com, at TomBartonSports as well over on Twitter, and have a very good day, everybody.